Tonight, we travel back 3 millennia to a city of legend, Troy. For centuries, it was just a poem, a tale of gods, heroes, and a beautiful queen. But the earth holds secrets that parchment cannot keep. We're going beneath the myth to find the metal, the stone, and the blood that confirm the siege. Close your eyes, feel the cold wind from the Aegean, and let's explore why the Trojan War is the moment history and myth violently collided. Before this video continues, I just want to say something from the heart. It takes me days of effort and sleepless nights to bring you these videos, but very few people subscribe. I'm honestly disheartened because every video I make is for you, to entertain, inspire, and give you something meaningful to watch. Please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe. Your support means everything to me. It's the only thing that keeps me motivated to work harder and bring you even better content every time. The Trojan War, immortalized by Homer, is remembered for its heroes and its gods. But the true, grinding reality of the conflict was a 10-year logistical and physical nightmare. A relentless, unforgiving siege. This was a war fought not in epic, sweeping battles, but in the miserable, repetitive physics of sustained human endurance, where the greatest enemy was not Hector or Achilles, but monotony and scale. Your life as a soldier in the Aegean Greek army would begin by confronting the sheer, brutal immensity of the walls. Troy, known archaeologically as Hisarlik, was a fortress of legendary strength, built high upon a natural mound that gave its defenders a catastrophic advantage. These walls were not simply barriers. They were a profound psychological weapon. To the Aegean soldier, the walls represented an impassable finality, an unyielding shield separating him from victory and home. They were too tall for direct scaling, too thick for the primitive battering rams of the era, and too well manned by archers and spear throwers. Every assault was a suicidal sprint across open ground, culminating in a hopeless attempt to breach an impenetrable defense. The walls turned the vast, open plain of the Scamander River into a mere killing field. You would spend years looking at that stone barrier, day after day, week after week, watching as your comrades fell, attempting the impossible. This architectural defiance turned the siege into a mental torture chamber, a constant visual reminder of failure. This architectural reality fed into the second, most profound difficulty, the duration of the siege. The war lasted 10 agonizing years, a span of time utterly unimaginable to a modern soldier. For the young man who signed up for a glorious, quick campaign, those 10 years meant the loss of his entire youth, the complete erasure of his old life, and the probable abandonment of his property and family back home. The vast majority of the time was spent not in fighting, but in waiting. Imagine the psychological toll of this endless, repetitive existence, digging trenches, repairing palisades, fetching water, and watching the seasons change 10 times over, all while the impenetrable fortress still stood before you. This extended duration bred cynicism, despair, and mutiny. The men were constantly on the verge of revolt. Their faith in the leadership, in Agamemnon and Menelaus, eroding with every passing winter. The siege warfare of the Bronze Age lacked the technology for a decisive, swift conclusion. turning the entire conflict into a war of attrition and endurance. The siege was designed to break the Trojans' morale, but it broke the Achaeans' spirit first, leaving them fighting less for Helen and glory and more for the simple, desperate necessity of forcing a conclusion so they could finally go home. The war was defined by the long, deep breath taken between sporadic, deadly skirmishes. The survival of the Achaean army was entirely dependent on solving the crippling problem of logistics and supply. Supporting an estimated army of 100,000 men for a decade, thousands of miles from home, was an extraordinary feat of ancient engineering and will. Unlike the Trojans, who could sustain themselves by farming the rich fields behind their walls or by bringing supplies through their trade routes, the Achaeans were forced to live off the land and rely on infrequent, risky supply ships. To maintain their colossal army, the Greeks had to turn their vast camp, stretching miles along the beach, into a functioning, temporary city. They needed constant fresh water, thousands of tons of grain, timber for repairs, and replacements for worn armor. When the supply lines failed, as they often did, the army was forced into foraging and raiding the smaller, surrounding Trojan-allied cities. These raiding parties, led by heroes like Achilles, were often bloody, resource-intensive diversions, turning the main objective, Troy, into a side note to the perpetual need for food. The greatest daily threat was not the Trojan archer, but starvation and disease. Dysentery and plague would sweep through the crowded, unsanitary Greek camp, decimating the ranks far more efficiently than any Trojan spear. The siege was a constant, tense negotiation between the army's hunger and its ability to secure its next meal. Finally, the relentless siege revealed the stalemate and the failure of ancient technology. The war was fought at the technological limits of the late Bronze Age. The weapons, spears, swords, and bronze-tipped arrows were effective at killing individuals, but utterly ineffective against massive stone fortifications. The lack of gunpowder, sophisticated siege engines, like later Roman catapults, or large-scale mining operations, meant that the walls could not be consistently breached or undermined. This stalemate meant the war was reduced to the same small, repeated actions. Duels between heroes to raise morale, small skirmishes over temporary ground, and the repetitive, brutal job of burying the dead. The physics of the situation were clear. The attacking force, the Achaeans, needed an exponential advantage that their technology simply could not provide. The only possible way to win, as history proved, was not through sheer force or superior weaponry, but through a ruse, a trick, and psychological warfare. The 10 years were an exercise in futility, slow, agonizing realization that brute force, in the face of superior defense, was a guarantee of failure. The Trojan War was less an epic of glory and more a chilling testament to the logistical limits of ancient human endeavor. The Trojan War, in its most brutal reality, was driven by a single, terrifying force of nature, the ego and overwhelming martial prowess of Achilles, the greatest of the Achaeans. The war was less a geopolitical conflict and more a stage for one man's pursuit of immortality through slaughter. To understand the conflict is to understand the physics of Achilles' devastating, consuming rage. Achilles was not driven by patriotism or loyalty to the Greek cause. His entire motivation was the flaw of glory, Kleos. He knew his fate, to die young at Troy, but in doing so, to achieve eternal fame, a name that would echo through the millennia. This knowledge did not bring him peace. It brought him a cold, calculating fury. He fought with a reckless, almost suicidal intensity, because every victory, every man he killed, was a brick laid in the monument of his own fame. His immense skill with the spear was rooted in this existential dilemma, a terrifying blend of superhuman strength and profound self-pity. The Achaean camp understood this. Without Achilles and his Myrmidons, the siege was unwinnable. His presence on the battlefield alone was a terror weapon, causing Trojan formations to shatter at the mere sight of his armor. Yet, this pursuit of glory made him arrogant and dangerously volatile. When King Agamemnon, the commander-in-chief, publicly shamed him by seizing his captured prize, the slave girl Briseis, Achilles' focus immediately shifted. His rage, previously aimed at Troy, turned inward toward his own allies. His resulting withdrawal, his refusal to fight, was not an act of desertion, but a calculated strategy to prove the Achaean reliance on his singular, irreplaceable power. For years, the greatest warrior sat idle, listening to the desperate cries of his comrades, proving his ego was more important than the success of the entire expedition. The true engine of Achilles' devastating return was not patriotic duty, but the catastrophic event known as the cost of rage, Patroclus' death. When the Trojans, emboldened by Achilles' absence, threatened to burn the Achaean ships, his closest companion and dearest friend, Patroclus, begged to fight. Achilles, consumed by his wounded pride, permitted Patroclus to wear his legendary armor. The result was inevitable and tragic. Patroclus was killed by Hector. This was the moment the war ceased to be about glory or honor. It became about vengeance. Achilles' grief was so consuming, it bordered on madness. He rejected food, sleep, and reason. He emerged from his tent a changed man, shedding the arrogance of the spoiled demigod for the terrifying, focused intent of a mortal engine of destruction. His mother, the sea goddess Thetis, had the divine smith Hephaestus forge him new, magnificent armor. But the metal was cold comfort. The loss of Patroclus provided Achilles with the final, necessary catalyst, a justification for total, unrestrained slaughter. His previous glory-seeking was tempered. His return was purely for the cold, meticulous payment of a blood debt. This burning need for vengeance led directly to the central, most epic confrontation of the war, the duel with Hector. Hector, the noble prince and protector of Troy, understood the spiritual importance of this fight. He was the embodiment of duty, defending his city, while Achilles was the embodiment of rage, seeking personal satisfaction. The pursuit itself was cinematic and agonizing. Hector, running 3 full circuits around the walls of Troy, terrified, yet compelled by destiny to face his end. When Achilles finally caught him, the fight was brief and savage. The moment Achilles plunged his spear into Hector's neck, the one vulnerable spot not protected by the armor, was the turning point of the war. But the fury did not end with Hector's death. In an act of profound, dehumanizing rage, Achilles defiled the body, dragging Hector's corpse behind his chariot around the walls of Troy for days. This horrific ritual was a visceral expression of his madness, a final, brutal insistence on the utter destruction of his foe's honor and memory. This single act demonstrated that Achilles' fury was a corrosive force, capable of destroying not just his enemy, but his own humanity. Achilles' entire existence was a calculated trade-off, the price of immortality. He achieved his Kleos, becoming the subject of endless legend, but he paid for it with his life. The final consequence of his rage was his own death, shot by Paris in the heel, his one mortal spot, guided by the god Apollo. This demise, though inevitable, was the ultimate irony. He died, having successfully slaughtered the Trojans' chief defense, Hector, and allowing the Achaeans ultimate victory. But his death was cheap, fast, and undignified, a mortal end for a man who had transcended mortality through his rage. The story of the Trojan War is fundamentally the story of how one man's titanic ego and subsequent grief reshaped the course of history. Achilles was the war's engine, a weapon forged in pride and tempered by loss, proving that the most powerful force in ancient warfare was not technology or strategy, but the unrestrained, divine madness of a single, extraordinary man. The Trojan War, as recorded by Homer, was unique in ancient warfare because the battlefield extended far beyond the walls of Troy and the plains of the Scamander River. It reached the very halls of Mount Olympus. For the soldiers fighting and dying in the dust, their struggle was constantly mediated, manipulated, and often overshadowed by the whims and quarrels of the Olympian gods. This divine interference transformed the conflict from a simple siege into a grand, terrifying, and deeply personal celestial drama. The central mechanism of the war was direct, constant Olympian interference. The gods did not merely observe the conflict, they descended to the plains of Troy to fight alongside their favorite mortals, often masked by mist or disguised in the form of a human champion. The foundation of the conflict lay in a divine beauty contest judged by Paris, which resulted in the active, bitter partisanship of the three greatest goddesses. Hera for the Achaeans and Athena for the Achaeans harbored an unquenchable hatred for Troy, which had slighted them. Conversely, Aphrodite, who was promised to Paris, dedicated herself to protecting him and the Trojan cause. This divine bias meant that battles were not won by tactical genius or courage alone, but by sudden, unexpected celestial intervention. A hero on the verge of death might be whisked away in a cloud of mist by his divine patron, only to reappear unharmed later. An arrow meant for one man might be deflected by a fingertip tap from a goddess. This omnipresent, arbitrary intervention was a profound source of terror and instability for the mortal soldier. He knew his skill meant little if Poseidon decided to stir the earth beneath his feet, or if Apollo chose to guide a Trojan arrow directly to his heart. The human soldiers were mere pawns in a cosmic chess game, their lives disposable instruments in a grander, immortal feud. A spectacular example of this divine agency is seen in the shield of Achilles, crafted by the lame god Hephaestus, the divine smith. After Achilles loses his original armor with Patroclus, his mother, Thetis, appeals to Hephaestus. The shield Hephaestus forges is not just a piece of bronze. It is a cosmic map and a work of art depicting the entire human world. Cities at war, cities at peace, fields, dancers, and the vast ocean. This shield, worn by the greatest warrior, served as a profound reminder of the two realities colliding at Troy: the glorious, civilized human world and the brutal, divine chaos of the battlefield. When Achilles wore it, the shield did more than repel spears. It radiated a supernatural power that terrified the Trojans. Its divine origin ensured that the war's greatest weapon was entirely external to human capability, reinforcing the theme that mortal power was subservient to divine craftsmanship. For the mortals involved, the divine intervention often forced a terrifying reconciliation between fate and free will. The gods possessed foreknowledge, understanding precisely when and how each hero, Achilles, Hector, Patroclus, was destined to die. Yet, they actively participated in the events leading up to these inevitable deaths. Zeus, the king of the gods, often enforced the predetermined fate, but allowed his children and favorite heroes to temporarily evade it, thus magnifying the tragic scale of the conflict. The heroes' agonizing decisions. Hector choosing to leave the safety of the walls to face Achilles, or Achilles choosing a short, glorious life over a long, peaceful one, were made in spite of, or perhaps because of, the knowledge of their ultimate destiny. This collision of predetermined fate with furious human effort creates the true emotional core of the epic. The mortal struggle becomes a powerful, poignant counterpoint to the gods' cool detachment. The darkest expression of the gods' absolute power was the necessity of human sacrifice. The war could not even begin until the Achaean commander Agamemnon had appeased the goddess Artemis, who had stilled the winds necessary for the fleet to sail. Her price was the sacrifice of Agamemnon's own daughter, Iphigenia. This chilling demand illustrates the profound moral gulf between the divine and the human. To the gods, a mortal life, even that of a princess, was merely a bargaining chip, a required fee for logistics. Agamemnon's agonizing choice to betray his paternal duty for the sake of his martial duty sets the stage for the war as a whole, a conflict where human suffering is mandated by divine requirement. The gods did not just influence the war, they demanded payment in blood before the first spear was thrown. Ultimately, the presence of the gods elevated the Trojan War far beyond a Bronze Age land dispute. It created a world of profound instability, where death or glory could arrive not through skill or cowardice, but through the whim of an immortal. The soldier on the Trojan plain was fighting not only Hector's warriors, but also the active, tempestuous, and jealous will of Mount Olympus, making his struggle one of cosmic insignificance against a backdrop of eternal power. The Trojan War, a decade-long stalemate defined by unbreakable stone walls, was finally decided not by courage or strength, but by a chilling, brilliant act of psychological warfare and deception. The wooden horse. This was the final, devastating stratagem of the Achaeans, masterminded by the cunning Odysseus, which transformed a military failure into a victory sealed by silence and slaughter. The horse was the ultimate betrayal of trust, proving that the strongest walls can always be defeated by the weaknesses within the human mind. The entire gambit hinged on the trick. Odysseus understood that the Trojan walls could not be breached by force. He reasoned that the only way to breach the defense was to convince the Trojans to breach it themselves. Driven by hubris and religious faith, the plan was audacious, construct a massive, hollow, wooden horse, hide an elite strike force, the greatest Achaean heroes, including Odysseus himself, inside its belly, and then pretend to abandon the siege. The horse was presented as an offering to the goddess Athena, a desperate sacrifice to ensure the Achaean fleet's safe return home. The entire Achaean army burned their camp, sailed their ships just out of sight behind the island of Tenedos, and left behind only one man, Sinon, a master of deception, whose purpose was to sell the lie. The Trojans, exhausted by 10 years of siege, were psychologically primed to accept the narrative of victory and peace. The construction of the horse itself was a feat of engineering and operational stealth. Built from the abundant fir wood available near the camp, the object had to be large enough to hold at least 30 armed men, yet structurally sound enough to be pulled across the plain and into the city. The men inside, claustrophobic, terrified, and sworn to absolute silence, had to endure hours of suffocating darkness, the sounds of celebration above them, and the heavy thudding of the horse being dragged across the stone streets. The horse was not just a container, it was a psychological coffin, demanding extraordinary mental discipline from the heroes inside. They were forced to rely entirely on the success of the external lie, knowing that the slightest sound or the most minor crack in the construction meant certain discovery and brutal death. This enforced immobility and silence were an inversion of the usual heroic dynamic, where glory was achieved through noise and action. The Trojans' eventual downfall was sealed by the blindness of Troy, their fatal willingness to believe the most comforting lie. Despite the Achaean retreat, there were two distinct, logical voices warning the Trojans against the gift. The first was the prophetess Cassandra, whose gift was true foresight, and whose curse was that no one ever believed her. Her frantic warnings were dismissed as hysteria. The second, more terrifying warning came from Laocoon, a Trojan priest of Apollo. He thrust his spear into the side of the horse, shouting, "I fear the Greeks. Even when they bring gifts." His action proved the object was hollow, nearly shattering the Achaean plan. However, before the Trojans could investigate further, Laocoon and his two sons were visibly and violently crushed by two massive sea serpents, a punishment sent by the gods, Poseidon, a staunch Achaean ally, or Athena, to silence him. This divine intervention was the final, devastating piece of the trick, convincing the superstitious Trojans that Laocoon had been punished for blasphemy against Athena's sacred offering. The sight of the priest's agonizing, public death broke the last thread of resistance, clearing the path for the horse to be triumphantly pulled into the city. The final, horrifying act was the night of silent slaughter. The wooden horse was hauled into the heart of the city, a monumental effort that required tearing down a section of Troy's formidable 10-year unbreakable wall. That night, after a day of exhausted, drunken celebration where the Trojans believed they had finally won their freedom, the city slept deeply under the cloak of absolute darkness and silence. Sinon lit a beacon to signal the returning Achaean fleet. Then, the trap was sprung. The heroes, led by Odysseus, descended from the horse, quiet as shadows. This was not a battle. It was a systematic, intimate slaughter. The Trojans were killed in their beds, drunk, unarmed, and defenseless. The war that had been defined by the epic roar of battle ended in the choking sound of a throat being slit. the silent glint of a knife, and the quiet thud of a body falling to the stone floor. The betrayal was complete. The legacy of the wooden horse lies in its profound lesson that cunning defeats brute force. The horse circumvented the strongest physical defense by targeting the emotional and spiritual weaknesses of the human psyche, the yearning for peace, the intoxication of victory, and the terror of divine retribution. The result was the total, final annihilation of Troy, proving that the most effective weapon in warfare is not a spear, but a convincing lie. The enduring power of the Trojan War lies in its refusal to remain solely within the realm of myth. The story of Hector and Achilles, of the horse and the fall, carried such weight in the ancient world that it fueled a persistent question for centuries. Was Troy real? This format delves into the archaeological quest that turned Homer's epic from a bedtime story into a key piece of Bronze Age history, examining the collision of poetic myth and scientific discovery. The pivotal moment in this collision belongs to one man, Heinrich Schliemann, a wealthy German businessman and passionate amateur archaeologist. Schliemann was driven by a nearly fanatical belief that Homer's Iliad was a literal historical guidebook. Ignoring the consensus of scholars who placed Troy in different locations, he focused on a modest hill in modern-day Turkey known as Hisarlik. In the 1870s, Schliemann began his reckless and controversial excavations. His methods were crude and destructive. He drove wide, deep trenches straight through the mound, effectively destroying several layers of ancient settlement in his haste to find the city described by Homer. Schliemann's most famous, though often misinterpreted, finds include the discovery of a hoard of gold jewelry and artifacts he controversially labeled Priam's treasure. This discovery instantly catapulted the site into global fame, seemingly confirming the existence of the wealthy city described in the epics, while later archaeology proved that this treasure was actually discovered centuries before the likely date of the Trojan War, and thus could not have belonged to King Priam. Schliemann's single-minded faith and subsequent discoveries provided the irrefutable physical location of the city of Troy. His work forced the academic world to take the myth seriously, establishing Hisarlik as the true historical site of Ilion. The subsequent, more careful excavations revealed the true complexity of the site through the city layers. Archaeology showed that Hisarlik was not one city, but a long-lived settlement built and rebuilt upon the ruins of its predecessors, creating 9 distinct layers, labeled Troy Y through Troy 9. The quest became identifying which of these archaeological layers corresponded to Homer's massive, sacked city. Through careful study of pottery, defense structures, and evidence of burning, scholars eventually settled on Troy 6 and, more definitively, Troy 7a. Troy 7a was a late Bronze Age settlement that showed clear signs of a violent, destructive end by fire and potential warfare, matching the general time frame and narrative of the Trojan War, roughly 1250, 1180 BCE. Crucially, the city walls in this layer showed hurried internal repairs, indicating a period of high anxiety and perhaps a prolonged siege, lending credence to the 10-year duration of the epic. The size of the lower city, revealed by external trenchwork in the late 20th century, was far larger than previously assumed, suggesting a metropolis worthy of Homer's description. This scientific process successfully separated the historical core of the story. A large, fortified city at Hisarlik was besieged and destroyed. From the mythological embellishments, Achilles and divine intervention, beyond the heroic duels, the siege itself was likely rooted in the geopolitical reality of the real war, trade routes, and collapse. Scholars now suggest the conflict was less about a single queen, Helen, and more about economic and political control over the Dardanelles. The narrow strait that Troy strategically commanded. This strait was the vital choke point for all maritime trade entering and exiting the Black Sea, making control of the city immensely profitable and strategically crucial for the growing Mycenaean powers of Greece. The war is also placed within the wider context of the Bronze Age collapse, a catastrophic period around 1200 BCE that saw the widespread destruction of major Mediterranean civilizations, including the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and Egyptians. The Trojan War was likely one of many large-scale military conflicts during this turbulent era, fueled by widespread migration, famine, and resource scarcity. The historical reality suggests a series of attacks and retaliatory raids, perhaps condensed by Homer into a single 10-year event. The archaeological evidence confirms that the collapse of Troy was part of a larger, violent dissolution of ancient civilization, moving the war from a mythological vendetta to a socio-economic disaster. The final testament to the reality of Troy is the mythological legacy it created for subsequent civilizations. For the Romans, Troy was not just a ruined city, it was their origin point. The Roman poet Virgil wrote the Aeneid to trace the lineage of the Roman people, and specifically Julius Caesar, back to the Trojan hero Aeneas, who escaped the burning city. For the Greeks, the story became a defining foundation myth, unifying disparate city-states under a shared history of glory and conquest. Even if the details were inflated and the gods were added for dramatic effect, the story of the Trojan War became an essential tool for national identity and moral instruction. Thus, the Trojan War survives in two forms: the physical reality of the ruined walls of Hisarlik, confirming a historical, late Bronze Age conflict, and the enduring power of the narrative. Schliemann's spade proved the physical location, while the careful work of subsequent archaeologists placed the war within the true, brutal context of Bronze Age geopolitics, confirming that the myth was indeed built upon a massive, tragic, and very real historical foundation. And now, we leave the wind-swept plains and the shadow of the great horse. The war is over, the city has fallen, but the story remains. Let the clash of bronze and the sound of the collapsing walls fade into the quiet. The fight for history is done. You are safe now. The night is deep, and the wisdom of the ancients is yours to keep. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and drift into the silence.